He was bleeding into the earth my father swore was ours, and in that moment, I knew saving him would cost me everything. If you believe some bonds are forged in silence and fire, ride with me into this reckoning. The day Violet Evans stepped outside her cabin, the air was thick with dust and the bitter scent of dry grass. The sun hung low over the Montana sky, casting long shadows over the creek that ran behind the Evans homestead. Her boots kicked up small clouds of dirt as she made her way down to check on the goats, their bleats echoing against the barren hills. She hadn't expected to find him. There, half-shaded under the sprawling cottonwood, lay a man, his body sprawled awkwardly against the earth. The creek's murmurs seemed too quiet, as though nature itself held its breath. Violet froze, her heart hammering in her chest. He was a Lakota. She could tell by the beaded leggings, the feathers tangled in his long, dark hair, and the broken arrow lodged near his ribs. Blood darkened his skin, mixing with dust from the hard earth. She took a cautious step forward, her pulse quickening. The warnings her father had drilled into her as a child flashed in her mind. Don't trust them. Don't help them. But this man, though a stranger, didn't look like a threat. He looked lost, as if the land itself had worn him down to the bone. Her eyes flicked to the sky. The wind shifted, rustling the dry brush. It would be foolish to leave him. He would die out here alone, and no one would care. Sir, her voice cracked as she crouched beside him. Can you hear me? His eyelids fluttered, but he didn't respond. Violet swallowed hard, biting back the fear that surged through her. She couldn't leave him. She wouldn't leave him. Carefully, she reached out, touching his shoulder. He flinched, a low moan escaping his lips. His breath was ragged, shallow. With trembling hands, Violet began to pull him closer, using all the strength her slim frame could muster. His body was like dead weight, but she didn't stop. She dragged him, inch by inch, toward the shelter of the barn at the back of the homestead, away from the main trail, away from the prying eyes of any neighbors. Her arms burned with the effort, and her breath came in short, desperate gasps. When she finally laid him down in the straw, she felt a strange kind of relief. It was as if she had crossed some invisible line between fear and duty. She had no idea who this man was, but she couldn't let him die. She worked quickly, tearing away the blood-soaked leather, cleaning the wound as best she could. Her hands shook with each careful stitch she made along the deep gash. The silence around her was thick, oppressive, and Violet felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. Hours passed, and she could feel the ache in her bones as she knelt beside him, watching his chest rise and fall with each breath. The goats had grown restless, but Violet stayed by the stranger, her mind racing through every possibility. Who was he? Why was he here? Just as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the barn in shadows, the man's eyes fluttered open. There was confusion in them, but no fear. He stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to piece together what had happened. "You are settler," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper, rough like gravel. Violet nodded slowly, unsure of what else to say. "Yes. I live here. You were bleeding badly. I had to help." His eyes searched hers, a flicker of something, recognition, passing across his face before he closed his eyes again. His breathing was still uneven, but he was alive. "I'm Violet Evans," she said softly. "What's your name?" There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Ehen Wicasa." The words felt heavy in the air. "I am chief of my people." Violet's breath caught in her throat. A chief. She had just taken in a Lakota warrior, a chief at that. If anyone found out, it would mean her life. But even in the shadow of that fear, something in her stirred. She could not just turn him away. Not when he needed her. The days passed slowly. Violet's world, once filled with the routine clatter of farm work and the quiet of her solitary life, now had a new rhythm, a quiet, measured pulse of care and uncertainty. Ehen's fever came and went, and she found herself spending long hours beside him, applying cool cloths to his brow, speaking to him in soft murmurs when the pain seemed unbearable. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were clipped and measured, like stones being turned over in his mind before they fell from his lips. His Lakota was thick with the weight of his people's history, and Violet had learned little of it. She listened, though, not just with her ears, but with her heart, hearing something in his tone that spoke of loss. Violet had never been one for idle talk, but she found herself speaking to him more than she ever expected. She spoke of her life, her father's land, of the goats she tended and the cold winters that had claimed her mother and baby brother. She spoke of the long nights when the wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, and she had to learn how to survive alone. At first, she thought Ehen would be silent forever. But then, one evening, after she had brought him a bowl of broth and helped him sit up, he spoke again, his voice hoarse but steady. "You do not fear me," he said, his eyes scanning her face as if looking for a lie in her expression. Violet didn't know how to respond. Fear? She had known fear all her life, the fear of being alone, the fear of losing everything, the fear of the unknown. But this, she didn't fear him. At least not in the way she feared the strangers who came through town with their hard faces and dark intentions. "I don't fear you," she said simply, though the words felt fragile in her mouth. He studied her for a long time, his brow furrowing in thought. Then he gave a slight nod, as if accepting her answer, though something unspoken still lingered between them. Violet had often wondered what it would be like to understand another soul so deeply, to share a bond that went beyond words. But with Ehen, it felt like something both fragile and unshakable, like the first crack of dawn on a bitter winter morning, when the world seemed frozen but a new day was being born. In the quiet of the barn, while Ehen rested, Violet found herself wondering about his life, about the journey that had brought him to this broken place. He hadn't spoken of the battle he had mentioned before, only hinted at it in broken phrases when fever overtook him. One night, she asked, though her voice was tentative. "Tell me about your people, Ehen." His eyes darkened, the weight of 1,000 untold stories pressing down on him. "My people are the Lakota," he began slowly, as if the words themselves carried the grief of centuries. "We are a people of the land, of the buffalo and the wind. But there is little of that now. The soldiers have taken it all." His eyes closed for a moment, a shadow crossing his face as memories he could not escape surfaced. Violet's heart tightened in her chest. She didn't know what to say. The history of her people, the settlers, and the conflict between them and the Lakota, she had heard the whispers, the rumors. But hearing it from Ehen, seeing the pain in his eyes, made it all too real. This was no longer a history in a book. It was a man, lying before her, trying to survive in a world that had taken everything from him. "I didn't choose this life," he whispered after a long pause, his gaze fixed on the barn's low ceiling. "But it is the life I have." Violet nodded, unsure of how to comfort him. What words could bridge the gap between their worlds? She had learned that sometimes, there were no words, just the quiet understanding of shared solitude. As the days turned into weeks, Ehen's strength slowly returned. His fever faded, and the wounds Violet had stitched began to heal, though the scars remained, both physical and emotional. They worked together in silence, each with their tasks, but always aware of the other. The rhythm of the land, of the seasons changing, seemed to weave them closer together, though neither of them spoke of it. One morning, after Violet had been working in the garden, she returned to find Ehen sitting by the barn door, looking out across the hills. His face was unreadable, but his posture was relaxed, almost contemplative. Violet stood quietly for a moment, watching him. The bond between them had grown over the weeks, unspoken yet undeniable. She had become so accustomed to his presence that she couldn't imagine her days without him. And yet, a part of her still resisted. She was a settler, and he was Lakota. Could this bond truly survive in a world so divided? She cleared her throat softly, unsure if he had heard her approach. "Ehen," she called gently. His head turned slightly, and for the first time in days, he gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "The land calls to me," he said, his voice carrying a quiet certainty. "It speaks of something that is yet to be." Violet's heart skipped a beat. Was he thinking of leaving? Of returning to his people? The idea filled her with an unexpected pang of fear. For the first time, she realized how much she had come to care for him, how much she had come to rely on his presence. But she couldn't ask him to stay. Not when his heart, his spirit, belonged to the land he had been born to. The morning fog hung low over the land, weaving through the trees like a ghost of the past. Violet's breath misted in the air as she stood by the fence, watching the grazing goats. The cold seeped into her bones, but it was a familiar kind of cold. A cold she could bear. But now, her thoughts were not with the animals. They were with Ehen. She had heard him that morning, standing at the barn door, speaking softly to himself in his native tongue. He had been restless for days, and now, his silence seemed to be more than just the usual weariness of his healing body. It was as though he were trying to make peace with something far beyond the pain he had endured. Her heart twisted at the thought of him leaving. She hadn't asked him to stay, hadn't even spoken the words aloud, but she had hoped. She had hoped that, in some way, their paths might have crossed for a reason. That they might find something together. But now she wasn't so sure. Ehen had not spoken much about his life before the injury, about the people who had once been his, but the few words he had let slip painted a picture of a life far from this cabin, far from the quiet of her homestead. He was a leader, a chief. His people needed him. Could she, a settler's daughter, stand in the way of that? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to find Ehen approaching, his face serious but not unkind. There was a hardness to his expression, something that had not been there before. His gaze met hers, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them, as if he knew exactly what she had been thinking. "Violet," he said softly, his voice rough but steady. "I cannot stay." Her chest tightened, though she had been expecting it. Still, hearing him say it out loud felt like a weight crashing down upon her. She took a step forward, the cold air biting at her skin, but she didn't care. She had to say something, anything. "I know," she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. "But where will you go?" Ehen's gaze softened, just for a moment, before it hardened again with determination. "My people need me. They will not wait forever." Violet's heart ached, the words sinking deep into her chest. The land they had found together, the peace that had blossomed in the quiet of their days, had never truly been theirs to keep. The world outside, the one filled with conflict and old wounds, was still waiting to claim them both. She nodded slowly, the weight of it all pressing down on her. "I understand," she said. "But, please know that you will always have a place here, with me." Ehen's eyes met hers, searching, as if trying to find the truth in her words. After a long moment, he nodded once, the motion almost imperceptible. "Thank you." They stood in silence for a moment longer, the cold wind blowing through the trees, carrying with it the scent of snow and earth. Violet didn't know what the future held, didn't know if she would ever see him again. But she knew one thing for sure, she would not let him leave without knowing he was not alone. The following days passed in a blur of preparation. Violet kept to her usual routine, tending to the goats, working in the garden, but her thoughts were always with Ehen. He moved quietly around the homestead, always with purpose, but there was an unspoken heaviness in his movements, as if the weight of his decision was too much for him to bear. One morning, just before dawn, Violet found him by the barn, packing a small bundle with his belongings. His rifle leaned against the side of the building, and his gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the first light of day was beginning to spread across the hills. She approached him slowly, unsure of what to say. When he heard her footsteps, he turned, his face a mask of calm. But his eyes betrayed him. There was a sadness there, a quiet longing that spoke volumes. "You leave soon," Violet said, her voice barely more than a murmur. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Ehen nodded, his jaw tightening as he met her gaze. "Yes." For a moment, they simply stood there, the silence between them thick with all the words that had never been spoken. Then, without warning, Ehen stepped closer. His hand, calloused and warm, reached for hers. She didn't pull away. In fact, her heart fluttered as his fingers brushed against hers, steady but sure. "I will never forget you, Violet Evans," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "Your kindness, your strength, it is a gift I will carry with me." Tears stung Violet's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had known this day was coming, had known from the moment she first laid eyes on him that their time was limited. But hearing him speak those words made it real, made it hurt in ways she hadn't anticipated. "I will remember you too, Ehen Wicasa," she whispered. "I will remember you always." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The wind held its breath, the hills stood silent, and the only sound was the beating of their hearts, two souls, tied together by the quiet bond of a shared past, a shared pain. Then, Ehen took a step back, his grip on her hand loosening. "It is time." His words were final, but there was no bitterness in them. There was only acceptance. Violet nodded, though her throat was tight. She watched as he turned and walked toward the distant hills, his silhouette growing smaller with each step. The land, vast and endless, stretched out before him, offering both freedom and sorrow in equal measure. And Violet, she stood there, watching him go, knowing that the world was larger than she could ever truly understand, but that the space he had left in her heart would remain forever. The days following Ehen's departure were quiet, too quiet. The rhythm of the homestead had become dull without him, like a song missing its most resonant chord. Violet threw herself into her work, keeping the farm running with the same steady hand she always had, but the heart that had once driven her actions felt distant. The goats were fed, the barn was kept in order, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Her hands, which had once been so confident in their task of mending wounds, felt unsure when she worked alone. It was as though Ehen's presence had breathed life into the very air she breathed. Without him, everything seemed slower, quieter, and less vibrant. Winter had come hard that year, blanketing the land in a cold, indifferent layer of snow. The creek was choked with ice, and the wind howled across the plains, filling the air with the scent of dry earth and frost. Violet would look toward the hills every morning, searching the horizon for a glimpse of him. But there was nothing. Only the vast stretch of white and the gray sky above. She had not heard from him since he left, though she held on to the hope that somehow, in some way, he would return. Perhaps it was foolish, this hope she clung to, but in a world that had taken so much from her, it was the one thing that made sense. It was the one thing that kept her heart steady. Her hands were working the needle on her worn coat one evening when she heard a knock on the door. It was a soft, hesitant sound, but it carried a weight that made her pulse quicken. She dropped the coat on the table, wiped her hands on the front of her apron, and walked to the door. When she opened it, she didn't see Ehen. Instead, there stood a man she did not recognize, tall, broad-shouldered, with the same stern expression that marked the settlers who passed through the town. His face was lined with age, his eyes sharp and calculating, and there was a rifle slung across his back. His boots were worn from travel, and he looked like a man who had spent too many nights on the trail. "Miss Evans," he said gruffly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I'm looking for a man named Ehen Wicasa. He's a Lakota chief." Violet's heart stopped. For a moment, she could not breathe. The name, his name, hit her like a blow to the chest. She hadn't expected this. She had been expecting solitude, silence, not the return of men with questions she had no answers to. "He's gone," she said, her voice flat and steady, though the truth stung like a bitter wind. "He left weeks ago. You won't find him here." The man studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as though searching for any hint of a lie. Violet stood her ground, her heart racing, but her body refusing to betray her. "You're sure?" the man pressed, his gaze shifting over her, inspecting her, as though trying to piece together the story she wasn't telling. "I'm sure." Violet's voice was firm now, though a flutter of doubt stirred deep inside her. She had to protect him. The man seemed to weigh her words carefully before giving a single nod. "If you see him again," he said, his tone softening slightly, "tell him we're looking for him. Tell him the war isn't over yet." Violet nodded, her throat tight. She didn't trust this man, didn't trust the words that spilled from his mouth. But she couldn't let him see her fear. She couldn't let him see that she was already losing hope that Ehen would return. When the man turned and left, disappearing into the falling snow, Violet felt a coldness creep into her bones. It was a reminder of the world outside, of the men who still hunted for the Lakota, of the war that had torn their worlds apart. It was a reminder of the reasons Ehen had left, of the things that had driven him away from her and the life they might have had together. But Violet wasn't one to give up. She would not let him be forgotten, not if she could help it. She spent the next few days in silence, her hands working faster than ever, as if the movement could keep her mind from dwelling on the inevitable. She had no word from Ehen, no sign of his return, but still, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, somewhere, watching over her. And then, one evening, when the sky was painted in hues of purple and gold, she heard the sound of hooves crunching the snow outside. She rushed to the window, her heart skipping a beat, but it wasn't Ehen. It was Micah, the old man who passed through every few weeks with supplies. His wagon was loaded with sacks of grain and dried fruit, his horse tired from the journey. "Micah," Violet called as she opened the door, stepping out into the cold. "I didn't expect you today." He gave her a slow smile, his eyes twinkling despite his age. "Weather's been rough. Thought I'd get here early while I still could. Got your order, some flour, sugar, dried peaches. She nodded, her eyes scanning the road behind him, searching for any sign of Ehen. But the road was empty. "Thanks," Violet said, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. She knew it was foolish to hope. He had left. He had made his choice, and she had to live with it. As Micah unloaded the goods, he glanced at her, his eyes narrowing as if he could read the sadness in her eyes. "You sure you're all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but genuine. Violet nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. Just been a long winter." Micah didn't ask more. He knew better. Instead, he handed her the bundle of supplies. "Take care, Miss Evans. Snow's coming again. You'll want to stock up while you can." With that, he climbed back into his wagon, the horses stirring restlessly as he cracked the reins and set off down the snow-covered road. Violet watched him disappear into the distance, the weight of the silence hanging in the air. The days grew longer as winter slowly released its grip on the land. Violet felt it in her bones, the thawing of the earth, the first stirring of life beneath the snow. Yet, in her heart, the winter lingered, thick and unyielding. She had told herself that Ehen was gone, that his path had led him far away from her, perhaps back to his people, to the land where he belonged. But each morning, as the frost on the windows began to melt, she found herself gazing out over the hills, hoping, praying for his return. The land, she knew, had always been the constant in her life. Her father had taught her how to read its signs, how to feel its rhythms. She could tell when the weather was about to change, when a storm was coming, when the soil needed care. But this longing in her chest, this uncertainty, was something she could not read, could not understand. It was a force of its own, powerful and relentless. And then, on a morning like any other, as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the sound of birds returning from the south filled the air, she saw him. Ehen. It was as though the earth had opened up and brought him back to her. He rode across the frozen field, his horse moving steadily beneath him, the wind tossing his dark hair back. His face was hard, but there was something in his eyes, something that told her that he had not come back by chance. Violet's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't know whether to run toward him or stay where she stood, rooted to the spot. There was no question in her mind that he had returned, but why? What had brought him back? She stepped forward, her boots crunching softly on the still frozen ground, her mind a swirl of questions and emotions she couldn't name. Ehen dismounted when he reached her, his eyes never leaving hers. He was different, calmer, stronger, as though he had been shaped by the trials of his journey. Yet there was something in his face, in the way his shoulders were set, that spoke of battles fought within him. "You came back," Violet said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and relief. Ehen nodded, his expression unreadable. "I had to." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning that neither of them spoke aloud. The land stretched out before them, silent and vast, but it wasn't just the land they had to confront now, it was everything that lay between them. The differences, the histories, the struggles that neither of them had the answers to. "Why?" Violet asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though she already knew the answer. She had known it all along. "Because I couldn't leave," Ehen replied simply. "Because the land calls to me, and it calls to you too, doesn't it?" Violet's heart ached at his words, and for a long moment, she didn't know how to respond. She had always known the land called to her, her father had taught her that. But hearing it from Ehen, hearing him speak of it so plainly, made her realize something she hadn't allowed herself to understand. The land, the earth, wasn't just a place to live. It was something deeper. Something that bound them together. Her eyes searched his, looking for something more, something that would tell her whether this was the beginning or the end. She had waited so long for him to come back, but now that he was here, she wasn't sure what to do next. "You can stay," Violet said quietly. "You can stay with me, if you want." Ehen's gaze softened, but there was still a wariness in it. "Do you think it is that simple?" Violet looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had wanted him back, had longed for him to return, but she knew now that it wasn't just about wanting. It was about something deeper. Something that neither of them could fully explain. "I don't know," she said softly. "But maybe we can try." Ehen stepped closer, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of them standing there, the silence speaking louder than any words ever could. He reached out, taking her hand in his fingers warm and steady. "Then we will try," he said, his voice low, but certain. "We will build something new. Together." Violet nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and fear. This was the beginning of something. But whether it would be a life of peace, or whether the past would come back to tear it all apart, neither of them could know. The land, they both knew, would always call to them. It was their home, their foundation. But it was also a battleground. And the battle between the past and the future, between what they had known and what they could build, had only just begun. Spring's breath had not fully thawed the land when Violet and Ehen began the work of building something new. The days were longer now, the earth softening beneath their feet, but there was a coldness that still lingered, hidden beneath the warmth of the sun. It wasn't the kind of cold you could feel on your skin, but the kind that lingered in your heart. Old wounds ran deep in this land, and Violet knew that no matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they built together, they could not erase the past. They spent their days clearing the field for planting. Ehen knew the land better than she did, and though Violet had grown up on it, there were things about the earth, the rhythm of the seasons, that she hadn't understood until now. He taught her how to read the weather and the way the animals moved, how to know when the soil was ready to receive the seed. They worked in silence, side by side, their movements synchronizing in a quiet dance of labor. But there was always something unsaid between them. Something that neither of them could quite name. Violet would catch him looking at her, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't read, something ancient and heavy. She knew that he was thinking of his people, of the Lakota, and the life he had left behind. But she didn't ask. Not yet. One evening, as they sat beside the fire, Ehen spoke, his voice low and heavy with meaning. "The soldiers will come," he said, his eyes fixed on the crackling flames. "They will come because they know I am here." Violet's stomach tightened at his words, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. She had known, deep down, that this moment would come. The land they were trying to build a life on was not just land, it was a battleground. And though they had tried to escape it, the war was always looming over them, like a shadow they could never outrun. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Ehen looked at her then, his gaze fierce and resigned. "I don't know. It depends on how quickly they find out." Violet's heart ached at the thought of losing him, of losing this fragile piece they had found together. But she knew that the world they were living in was never meant to last. The settlers and the Lakota were two worlds colliding, and no matter how much they wanted to build something new, the old forces would always be at work. "We could leave," she said quietly, her eyes on the fire. "We could go somewhere else, start over again." Ehen shook his head, his expression unreadable. No. I cannot run from my people. And I cannot run from what I have done. There was a weight to his words, a burden that Violet couldn't fully understand. She had seen the scars on his body, the signs of battles fought and lost. She had seen the pain in his eyes when he spoke of his people, of the Lakota who had been driven from their lands. And though she understood it, she couldn't help but wonder if it was enough. Was it enough to justify everything? To justify the risk of their lives, of their future together? The silence between them stretched, heavy and thick. The fire crackled, sending small embers into the air, but neither of them moved. Finally, Ehen spoke again, his voice softer this time. I wish I could stay, he said, his gaze turning toward her. But I cannot. Not when the war calls me. Violet felt the sting of his words deep in her chest, but she didn't argue. She knew that the war was never far from his mind. It had shaped him, molded him into the man he was now. She knew he would never be free of it, no matter how much they wished for peace. Then we'll fight together, she said, her voice steady and determined, though her heart was breaking inside. If they come, we'll fight together. Ehen's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The air around them grew still, and in that silence, there was a shared understanding. This was their fight now. Their fight for a future. And though they didn't know what the outcome would be, they would face it together. The next morning, they went to the barn to prepare the horses. They packed what little they could carry, food, blankets, and supplies for the journey ahead. They knew the time was coming when they would have to leave, but until then, they would make their stand. Violet's hands trembled as she packed the last of the things she would need, her heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. Ehen worked beside her, his movements quiet but sure. He didn't say much, but there was something in the way he moved, something that told her he had already made his decision. When they were done, they stood outside the barn, looking out over the land they had tried to call home. The wind blew cold across the plains, carrying with it the scent of earth and dust. Violet's chest tightened as she thought of the home she had lost, of the life she had wanted to build. But there was no time for regret. The war was coming, and they would have to face it together. The wind howled through the cracks of the barn, a reminder that winter still held the land in its grip. The air was sharp, biting, and as Violet and Ehen prepared for the uncertain journey ahead, the sense of urgency weighed heavily on them. The land, once full of hope and new beginnings, now felt like a battleground, and neither of them could deny it any longer. Violet ran her hands over the leather reins of the horses, the familiar scent of animal and earth grounding her in this moment. She felt the cold in her bones, but it was not the cold of the land, it was the cold of fear, of knowing what was to come, of knowing that their fragile peace had been shattered. Ehen stood nearby, his eyes scanning the horizon. He hadn't spoken much since their decision to leave, but Violet could see the tension in his posture, the way his hand gripped the hilt of his knife. He was ready for the fight. But was she? She had never imagined that the life she had known, this quiet, simple life, would be torn apart by the echoes of war. The settlers, the soldiers, the land, it was all part of a story that she had never truly understood until now. The divisions between her and Ehen were not just cultural, they were historical, rooted deep in the earth, in the blood of those who had come before them. Do you think we'll make it? Violet asked, her voice almost lost in the wind. Ehen turned to look at her, his face expressionless. We will make it. His voice was steady, though there was an undercurrent of doubt in his eyes. We are not the first to fight for what we love. Violet nodded, though the doubt still lingered in her chest. She had seen the soldiers in the distance, their dark figures moving through the hills like shadows. The war was never truly over, it had just taken new forms. The soldiers would come for them, and they would not stop until they had reclaimed what they believed was theirs. "I don't want to leave," Violet said softly, almost to herself. Ehen stepped closer, his presence grounding her as always. "Then we stay and die." His words were blunt, but there was no malice in them. Only the reality of the situation. "I would rather fight beside you than watch you fade into the cold." Violet's heart tightened at the thought. She knew he was right. They could not stay. The world they had tried to build together would be destroyed by forces beyond their control. The soldiers would not hesitate. And yet, part of her still clung to the dream of a life without the shadow of war. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Ehen turned his gaze toward the distant hills, his face hardening. "We go to the Lakota. To my people. I will not run anymore." His voice was low, resolute, and in it, Violet could hear the weight of the decision he had made. He had chosen to stand with his people, no matter the cost. Violet felt a pang in her chest at the thought. She had always known that Ehen was bound by his duty to his people, but this was more than just a promise. This was the legacy of 1,000 battles, 1,000 lives lost. And now, she was part of it. "Then we go," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "We fight for something worth fighting for." Ehen looked at her, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to smile. It was small, fleeting, but it was enough to remind her that they were in this together. No matter the odds. The journey was grueling. The snow was heavy, the wind relentless, and the cold seeped into their bones with every step. Violet kept her head down, her eyes on the path ahead, while Ehen rode silently beside her. The world around them was silent, save for the sound of their horses' hooves crunching through the snow. They didn't speak much. What could they say? Words were no longer enough. There was only the land, the fight, and the life they were trying to hold on to. Each step felt like a battle against the inevitable, a struggle to keep the hope alive that they could still make a life together. But the closer they got to the Lakota camp, the more Violet could feel the tension in Ehen's posture. She knew that he was torn between his loyalty to his people and the life he had found with her. There was no easy path forward, no clear answer. There was only the choice to keep going. One night, as they set up camp by the fire, Ehen spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to come with me," he said, his eyes flicking to her. "You can turn back." Violet's heart clenched at the thought. She knew what he was offering, an out. A way for her to escape the dangers that lay ahead. But she had already made her decision. She was with him, no matter where the road led. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly. "Not now. Not ever." Ehen's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift from his shoulders. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers in the dim light of the fire. "Then we face it together," he said quietly. Violet nodded, the firelight dancing in her eyes. They would face it together. They would fight for what they had found, even if the world was determined to tear it apart. The journey toward the Lakota camp was long and treacherous, the days blending together in a haze of exhaustion and uncertainty. The cold continued to bite at their skin, but Violet had long stopped feeling the chill. What mattered now was the path ahead, the destination that loomed ever closer. The land was a constant companion, silent and unyielding, and the tension between her and Ehen seemed to mirror the harshness of the world around them. But as they neared the outskirts of the camp, something changed. The air grew thicker, more charged with an energy that neither of them could quite place. The horses seemed restless, their ears flicking back and forth, as though sensing something they could not see. The land felt different here, alive in a way that made Violet's pulse quicken. She knew they were close. As they rode toward the camp, the distant figures of the Lakota could be seen, moving through the smoke of their fires, their figures barely visible in the fog that clung to the ground. The camp was peaceful at first glance, but Violet could sense the tension beneath the surface. The war had never truly ended, and even here, amidst the people of the land, the shadow of soldiers and settlers loomed large. Ehen rode ahead of her, his movements confident, yet there was a wariness in his eyes, a tension that she could not ignore. Violet had seen this before, he was preparing for something. For a confrontation, perhaps, or something even more dangerous. They reached the center of the camp, where several of the Lakota warriors gathered around a fire, their faces stern and unreadable. Ehen dismounted and walked toward them with purpose, his gaze meeting theirs without hesitation. Violet followed closely behind, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what to expect. One of the men stepped forward, his face familiar yet distant. Violet recognized him from the stories Ehen had told her, the man who had once been a close ally, now a leader in the Lakota camp. His name was Tsunk, and his presence commanded respect. Ehen Wicasa, Tsunk said, his voice gruff but respectful. You return to us, but not in the way we had hoped. Ehen met his gaze with quiet resolve. I had no choice, Tsunk. The land called to me, and so did my people. Tsunk studied him for a moment, then turned his eyes to Violet, who had been standing quietly by Ehen's side. There was an unreadable look in his eyes, one that made Violet's skin prickle with unease. And this is the woman who follows you? He asked, his tone softer, but still calculating. Violet stood a little straighter, meeting his gaze with a steady look. I am Violet Evans, she said, her voice firm. I came with him. I am not afraid. Tsunk's eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing her words. He had clearly heard of settlers like her, outsiders who were more than just strangers, but symbols of the world that had taken so much from his people. Violet could see the wariness in his eyes, the suspicion that came with years of conflict. You should be afraid, he said, his voice dropping to a lower register. There are many who would see you as a threat. Before Violet could respond, a voice called out from the edge of the camp, cutting through the tension like a knife. Tsunk, what are you doing? The voice was sharp, commanding, and when Violet turned to look, she saw a woman approaching, the kind of woman who exuded authority with every step. Her posture was regal, her face etched with the wear of years spent leading and fighting for survival. Her presence was undeniable, and Violet could feel the weight of her gaze the moment their eyes met. Ah, you have brought her here. The woman's voice was cold but not unkind, and her eyes flicked briefly to Violet before returning to Ehen. And what do you expect us to do with her, Ehen Wicasa? The woman's words struck Violet like a blow, and she could feel the tension building again, the air thick with the weight of their unspoken thoughts. She knew she wasn't wanted here, knew that she represented everything that had torn apart their world. But still, she stood her ground. I came because I believed in Ehen, Violet said, her voice steady. And I am not leaving. The woman studied her for a moment, her eyes like sharp blades, before turning to Ehen. Is this your choice? Ehen's silence was telling. He didn't speak immediately, as if choosing his words carefully, understanding that every word would weigh heavily on what came next. Finally, he spoke. "It is my choice. And it is hers as well." The woman didn't reply at once. Instead, she took a step closer, her presence commanding, yet not unkind. "Very well," she said, finally softening her tone. "But know this, Violet Evans, your presence here does not come without cost. There are many who would not accept you. And there will be those who will not forgive." Violet nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She had no illusions about the world she was entering. The Lakota had suffered at the hands of settlers for far too long, and her presence here, no matter her intentions, would stir the memories of that past. Ehen turned to her then, his eyes meeting hers with quiet determination. "We will face whatever comes," he said softly. "Together." Violet felt a wave of relief wash over her at his words. She had been uncertain, afraid of what might happen, but now she knew, whatever this new life was, she wouldn't face it alone. And yet, the reality of what they had stepped into settled around her like a heavy cloak. The camp, the Lakota people, the soldiers, they were all parts of a larger story, a story that neither she nor Ehen could escape. The fight was not over. It had only just begun. The camp was quiet, but beneath that silence, there was a tension that stretched across the land like an unseen thread. Violet sat by the fire that night, the glow of the flames flickering against her face, her hands restless in her lap. She had learned quickly that the Lakota were a proud and resilient people, and that her presence here would not be easily accepted. There were many eyes watching her, many judgments being passed in hushed whispers. But there was also something else, a tentative curiosity, as if her being here was an enigma they couldn't fully comprehend. Some saw her as a threat, a symbol of everything that had been taken from them. Others, like Ehen's old friend Tasunk, saw her as an ally, or at least, as someone who was willing to stand beside Ehen, despite the odds. It was a delicate balance, one that Violet wasn't sure how to navigate. Her life had been turned upside down in the blink of an eye, and now, in the heart of this world she didn't fully understand, she was forced to make decisions that would define her future, and Ehen's. She glanced over at him. He was standing a few feet away, speaking in low tones with the woman who had spoken earlier, the one who had looked at her with such scrutiny. She was a leader, Violet could tell, a woman whose presence commanded respect and whose voice carried the weight of years spent leading her people through hardship. Ehen's face was unreadable, but Violet could see the subtle tension in his posture, the way his jaw tightened as he listened to the woman's words. This was a conversation they had to have, one they couldn't avoid. There were things between them, between him and his people, that couldn't be ignored. Violet's thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice beside her. "You do not belong here, settler." The words were blunt, harsh, and Violet turned to see a young woman standing next to her, her arms crossed and her eyes sharp. She was older than Violet, perhaps by a few years, but there was a fire in her eyes that made her seem much older. "I know I don't," Violet replied quietly, her voice steady despite the sudden surge of unease. "But I am here because Ehen chose me. I won't leave him." The woman's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Violet thought she might say something else, something more hostile. But instead, she simply shook her head and muttered something under her breath in Lakota. She stepped away, leaving Violet to wonder what had been said, but Violet didn't dwell on it. The young woman's words stung, but they were not unexpected. She was a settler, an outsider. And in a place like this, she was a symbol of everything that had caused pain, destruction, and loss. It was late by the time Ehen returned to her side, his face hard but his eyes soft when they met hers. She is my sister, Ehen said quietly. Her name is Wicasa. She does not trust you, but she does not trust anyone who is not Lakota. Violet nodded. I understand. She is right to be wary. She paused before adding, I'm not here to make trouble. I'm here to help. Ehen looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Finally, he nodded, his gaze softening. I know. But this life, Violet, it is not one for the faint of heart. The path we walk will not be easy, not for either of us. Violet swallowed, her throat dry. She had known this was coming, had known that their decision to come here, to stand with his people, would not be an easy one. The world was not kind to those who strayed from the path they were meant to follow. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was where they were meant to be. This was where she was meant to be. I'm not afraid, Ehen, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. I'll follow you. Wherever you go. He reached for her hand then, his fingers warm against hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. There was no war, no fear, no judgment, only the two of them, standing together in the firelight. Then we face it together, he said softly. Whatever comes, we face it together. The days that followed were a blur of work and conversation, each moment a reminder that they were living on borrowed time. Ehen spent his days with the other leaders of the camp, speaking of strategy, of what was to come, and of the tension that still hung in the air. There were murmurs of soldiers moving closer, of settlers who had begun to stir in the nearby towns, and of the encroaching threat that loomed over them all. Violet kept herself busy, helping where she could, learning from the women of the camp, who took her in with guarded curiosity. They taught her how to make tools, how to sew with a finer stitch, how to move through the world with a sense of purpose that she had never known before. The work was hard, but it gave her something to focus on, something to keep her mind from wandering to darker places. One evening, as Violet sat by the fire, Wicasa approached her again, her face unreadable. This time, she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she sat down beside her, her eyes flicking to the fire and back to Violet. You are stronger than you seem, she said finally, her voice softer than before. Many of us thought you would leave by now. Violet met her gaze, her heart swelling with something like pride. I'm not going anywhere. For a moment, Wicasa studied her, then gave a slight nod. Then we shall see. The land is not easy to tame, even for those born to it. Violet couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve in those words, as though Wicasa's acknowledgement was a step toward acceptance. She might not be fully embraced by the Lakota people, not yet, but she was beginning to earn their respect, one small step at a time. As the days turned into weeks, Violet and Ehen settled into a rhythm. The war, the soldiers, the settlers, they were all still out there, waiting, moving, circling. But for the first time in a long while, Violet felt like she was home. She didn't know what the future held, or whether peace would ever truly come. But she knew one thing, no matter the cost, she would stand with Ehen. She would stand with the Lakota, and she would fight for the future she believed in. Spring had come, though it had not been gentle. The days were warmer, but the winds still carried the remnants of winter's chill. The Lakota camp, now more settled in its rhythm, seemed to breathe with a life of its own, its fires crackled late into the night, and the sound of drums could be heard echoing through the valley as the people gathered in the evening to sing, to tell stories, and to prepare for the battles that were yet to come. Violet had become more accustomed to the rhythm of the camp, to the patterns of daily life among the Lakota. She worked side by side with the women of the camp, learning the ways of the land and its people. There was no question now of whether she belonged. She had earned her place among them through her deeds, her work, and, above all, her commitment to Ehen and the future they both hoped to build. But as the days wore on, the tension around the camp only grew. Scouts returned with news of soldiers advancing, moving closer and closer to the camp's borders. The whispers of war were no longer a distant threat, they were a reality that could not be ignored. One morning, as Violet worked near the fire with Wicasa, a scout arrived, breathless and urgent. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "They are coming," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A large force. They'll be here by nightfall." Ehen, who had been standing near the council fire, turned at the scout's words, his expression hardening. The camp, which had been calm just moments before, now stirred with a quiet intensity. The women and children began to gather their things, preparing to move deeper into the hills, away from the inevitable confrontation. Violet felt a coldness creep into her chest, but she kept her face steady, her eyes fixed on Ehen as he walked toward her. His steps were firm, his presence commanding. There was no fear in him, not now, not anymore. He had been preparing for this moment since the day he first left his people's side. This was the fight he had known would come. "Violet," Ehen said, his voice low but filled with purpose. "It is time." Violet nodded. She had known this was coming, the land, the war, the fight for survival. But now that it was upon them, she wasn't sure how she felt. Her hands shook slightly, betraying the calm she was trying to project. She was not a warrior, not in the way the Lakota were. But she had fought for survival before, and she would do it again. For him. For the people she had come to love. "I'm ready," she said, though her voice was tight. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Ehen's gaze softened, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to still. The noise of the camp faded, and there was only the sound of their breath, the steady rhythm of the moment they shared. "Together," he repeated, his voice quiet but full of conviction. And then, as the sky darkened and the wind began to pick up, they prepared for what was to come. The sun had long set by the time the soldiers arrived, their silhouettes cutting through the night like shadows. Violet stood with Ehen and the other leaders of the camp, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with anticipation, and the weight of history pressed down on her shoulders. The Lakota were ready, ready to fight, ready to defend their land, their way of life. Violet had never been in a battle before. She had never faced the kind of violence that now lay ahead of them. But she knew one thing, she would not back down. Not now. Not when everything she had fought for was at risk. The first shots rang out just as the moon crested the sky, casting an eerie light over the valley. The battle was swift, chaotic, and violent. The soldiers, well-trained and heavily armed, charged forward, their rifles firing into the night. But the Lakota were fierce, their warriors moving like shadows, striking with precision and speed. Violet found herself caught between the chaos and the stillness of the land. The world around her seemed to spin, but Ehen's presence kept her grounded. He fought beside her, his movements sharp and deadly, but always, always aware of where she was. They had come this far together, and they would see it through to the end. The night wore on, the battle intensifying with every passing moment. Violet could hear the cries of men, the sound of hooves pounding the earth, and the crack of gunfire. But through it all, there was one thought that kept her going: they would not lose. By dawn, the soldiers had retreated. The battle was over. The camp was silent now, the air heavy with the cost of what had just transpired. The Lakota had won, but at a great cost. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, the silence a stark reminder of the violence that had taken place. Violet stood beside Ehen, her body tired and aching from the night's ordeal. She looked around at the camp, at the people who had fought so fiercely to protect their land, their way of life. And though the battle was won, she knew the war was far from over. "We've done it," Ehen said softly, his voice hoarse but steady. Violet nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. "For now," she said quietly. "But the world isn't finished with us yet." Ehen turned to her, his expression unreadable. But in that moment, as they stood together in the quiet aftermath, she knew one thing for certain: they would face whatever came, together. The circle would remain unbroken.